Hi and welcome to Sicha's Academy. Here we're going to be learning a Sicha. This Sicha is found in Lakutas Sichas Chelik Hey, Parshas Vayeitzei, and it's Sicha Beis. And the topic of the Sicha is that one of the things we learn in this week's Parsha is that Yaakov married Rachel and Leah, who were sisters. And the Rebbe will analyze and explain on the level of Pshuta Shel Mikra how Yaakov was permitted to marry two sisters, something which is forbidden in the Torah. So let's begin. The topic of the Sicha is, and the context within which the Sicha happens is as follows. It's well known that whenever there's a question on a story or on a teaching in the Chumash, Rashi will address and answer the question. And when there's an obvious question that Rashi doesn't address and explain, it's because the answer is so simple and clear that there's no need to explain it, or because it's already answered based on an earlier Rashi. And considering that, in this week's Torah portion, we learned that Yaakov married Rachel and Leah, who were sisters. Now, it's known that the Avos fulfilled the entire Torah, even though it wasn't given yet. And if so, how did he marry two sisters? And now this is a question also in Pshuta Shel Mikra, and we don't find that Rashi addresses it. So just keep in mind that the focus of the Sicha is not how did Yaakov marry Rachel and Leah, who were sisters. The focus of the Sicha is how do we understand it in Pshuta Shel Mikra, and more importantly, how is it so obvious and simple that there's no need for Rashi to address it whatsoever? And the Rebbe now continues and presents. In Mefarshim, we find that there are many answers to this question. However, none of these answers are good for Rashi for two reasons. Number one, there are many arguments on these answers, making them far from simple, even on the level of Gemara, and therefore Rashi would have needed to explain them. And so from the fact that he didn't explain them indicates to us that those are not the answers that Rashi expects us to come to understand, because they're way too complicated for us to come to on our own. And number two, and you could say more importantly, each of the answers doesn't fit in line with Pshuta Shel Mikra, as we'll now proceed to explain. So number one, these answers would need to be explained and presented by Rashi if that's what he intended and accepts as the given answer. Number two, he couldn't have even written them because they're not in line with Pshuta Shel Mikra, as now we're going to explain. So let's begin with the first answer that's found. The Ramban says that the Avos only fulfilled the Torah while in Eretz Yisrael. So that answers our question. Therefore, since Lavan lived in Haran, Yaakov married Rachel and Leah when he was by Lavan, which was in Haran, which was outside of Eretz Yisrael. They wouldn't have kept the mitzvahs there. However, this doesn't work in Rashi, like we said. Rashi holds that even in Chutz La'aretz, the Avos kept the Torah. As we find that Yaakov told Esav, he said, "Im Lavan garti." Rashi says, "V'taryag mitzvahs shamarti." As we find that Yaakov told Esav that when he lived with Lavan, he kept all 613 mitzvahs. So this is not an answer that would fit in Pshuta Shel Mikra. Let's move on to another answer that's out there. Another answer is that Yaakov married Rachel and Leah because that's what Hashem told him to do. And obviously, if he received a clear command and instruction from Hashem to marry Rachel and Leah, he would be permitted and obligated to do so. However, this also doesn't fit in Pshuta Shel Mikra. In the Torah, it seems clear that the only reason Yaakov married Rachel was because that was his original intention. He wasn't successful, so he was attempting to do it again. We don't find any indication that this was a result of the command of Hashem. Let's move on to another answer that's found. Another answer is that the Avos and Imois were considered Gerim. Therefore, if we say that this was true, that they're Gerim, in regards to all the rules of a Ger, without exception, it comes out that Rachel and Leah weren't considered sisters, since, as we know, a Ger is like a newborn, and so they're not considered related. However, this too does not fit in Pshuta Shel Mikra. This cannot be the answer for Rashi for three reasons. Number one, we don't find anywhere that the Avos were like Gerim. And quite the opposite, it's known that not all their children kept the Torah. We find it by the Shvatim at certain points that they didn't keep the entire Torah before it was given. Number two, to say that a ger is like a newborn is not consistent with Pshuta Shel Mikra. And number three, the Isser to marry two sisters is based on logic. It's not just Exeris HaKasav, or it's not Exeris HaKasav at all. It's a logic-based mitzvah. Sisters naturally love one another, and being one of two wives of the same husband brings about feelings of distance and hate, jealousy, competition, and therefore it's usser. We don't want to create hatred, distance, competition, and jealousy between two people who have a natural love for one another. So this din wouldn't be affected even if a ger is considered to be a newborn, because they're still sisters who love one another, and we don't want to create that type of hatred and jealousy between them. And so we went through those three answers and showed how they don't fit in Pshut Shemikra. And now the key that will answer everything. The key is that when the Avos fulfilled the Torah, it was something optional and extra that they took upon themselves. Therefore, it is understood that in an instance where a mitzvah from the Torah contradicted one of the mitzvahs they were given explicitly, it would be against Hashem to do that mitzvah. If the Avos had a mitzvah that they were obligated to keep, one of the Sheva mitzvahs, for example, that contradicted a mitzvah in the Torah, they would not be permitted to do that mitzvah in the Torah, since the mitzvah that's from the Sheva mitzvahs B'nai Noach is obligatory, and this mitzvah in the Torah is optional, something that they're doing lifnim mishur sadin, to go beyond the letter of the law, but they can't push away something basic and necessary for something extra. And this explains something else. This is the reason in Pshut Shemikra why Avram didn't do the mitzvah of bris milah until he received the clear command from Hashem. There are various answers that are given for why Avram didn't do the mitzvah of bris milah. In Pshut Shemikra, the reason Avram did not do the mitzvah of bris milah and he waited till he got the command is for this very reason. The reason is because one of the mitzvahs B'nai Noach, one of the Sheva mitzvahs is that it is usher for a person to make himself bleed. It was given to Noach after the Mabul. A person is not allowed to be shefech dam atzmai. And therefore Avram wasn't allowed to break that isser with the intent of fulfilling an extra command of bris milah that he wasn't ever given. The basics and the requirements cannot be set aside for the optional and the extra. And now let's put the pieces in place. We have this general idea. It's under this framework that the mitzvahs of the Torah are considered optional and extra, and they cannot supersede and push aside a mitzvah that they were obligated to do. Now let's put the pieces into place. Besides the actual Sheva mitzvahs B'nai Noach, there were other mitzvahs that all of humanity accepted upon themselves. And just like the Avos couldn't neglect and push away a given command of Hashem in order to fulfill a mitzvah, like they spilling their own blood in order to do the mitzvah of bris milah, they couldn't do that. So they couldn't push away a given command of Hashem, spilling one's blood, in order to fulfill a mitzvah from the Torah, bris milah. So too they couldn't disregard an accepted practice that became a mitzvah for all of humanity. And now everything falls into place once we have those two things set up. Number one, that what they were obligated to do will obviously come before a mitzvah in the Torah, and it doesn't just include what they were obligated to do from a direct command from Hashem, but also things that were accepted by everybody. One of the accepted mitzvahs in those days was that people shouldn't cheat one another, and furthermore, that they would keep their word. Not just not to cheat, but to keep one's word. As we find that Yaakov accused Lavan of not keeping his word, and Lavan felt the need to defend himself. What's Yaakov accusing him? Lavan doesn't keep his word. And what's Lavan defending himself? He doesn't keep his word. Clearly we see that he was expected to keep his word. So now it makes perfect sense how Yaakov was allowed and even obligated to marry Rachel after marrying Leah. Yaakov was obliged to keep his word and marry Rachel. He told her that he would marry her. And the Rebbe adds that this point is further enforced in light of the fact that had Yaakov not married Rachel, it's not just that he wouldn't have kept his word. This would have caused her extreme suffering since she would have had to marry Esav. And so now everything falls into place and everything makes sense. And the Rebbe moves on to the Hira, the lesson. What is the lesson here? The lesson is, from here we see how incorrect it is for a person to be extra strict in their own pursuit of ruchnius on the account of another person, which would be getting for Yaakov, in his case, it would be him being concerned about not marrying two sisters, even though somebody else is suffering. He's doing something extra. He's not obligated to do that. And just as we find that the love that Hashem had for Avram was because he always measured out exactly what he needed and gave the rest away, as Chazal tell us, so too a person must ask himself if he is truly more important than the next person, that because of that, he will invest in Hidurim, since he's so important. So his Hidurim are really important. Is a person really that important that he'll invest in his Hidurim and the like, while another person is missing the basics? We find that Avram measured, he gave himself what he needed, and he gave everything away to others. A person should give themselves what they need, but to go beyond that and give themselves Hidurim, and within the context and framework that they're going to cause harm to somebody else, that's not the path that the Torah guides us to take. And here we see a clear Hira that the opposite is the correct way to go, that a person should think about the other person and set aside Hidurim that they themselves would otherwise be able to do.